Bible Scripture Trivia channel, presents a deep dive uncovering hidden gems in Genesis. Ever get that feeling? You know, cracking open a book you haven't touched since, like, forever ago, and suddenly you're seeing it in a whole new light.
Oh, absolutely. Like rediscovering an old friend, right?
Totally. And this time, that friend is the book of Genesis. We're taking a deep dive, but trust me, this isn't your grandma's Sunday school version. We're talking footnotes, wordplay, even those head-scratching contradictions.
It's amazing what you find when you get off the well-trodden path. I'm excited to unpack some of those hidden gems today.
See, that's what I'm talking about. Hidden gems. Now, I know you're thinking, footnotes, isn't that going to be a little dot dry? But hold on. These aren't your average snooze fest footnotes. These babies are packed with juicy tidbits about ancient culture, weird language quirks, and even some theological curveballs that'll make your head spin.
You're spot on, and that's what makes it so fascinating, especially with a book like Genesis, which has had such a massive impact on, well, everything. Literature, art, law, you name it. Understanding those little nuances gives us this whole new perspective on where those ideas came from.
Right. It's like suddenly you've got the inside scoop on Western civilization. Okay, so let's get down to business. We're starting at the very beginning, the creation story. Now, I know we all know the basics. God creates everything in 6 days, gets back on the seventh. Classic. But here's where things get interesting. The footnotes point out that the text never actually names the sun and the moon. What's the deal with that?
Great question. It all goes back to how people in the ancient Near East, basically we're talking about Mesopotamia, Egypt, that whole area, how they viewed names. Names weren't just labels, they held serious power.
Okay, so like Voldemort-level power. Should we be avoiding saying their names out loud?
Maybe not quite that extreme. But you're on the right track. To say a name, especially the name of a deity, was to invoke its power, potentially even control it. So to avoid naming the sun and moon directly was a way of sidestepping that whole power dynamic.
So it's like the writer's saying, yeah, those celestial objects are pretty cool, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The real MVP here is the one who made them.
Exactly. And it makes you think, doesn't it? In the ancient world where names were everything, God reveals his name, Yahweh, to his people. It's an act of incredible intimacy, almost unheard of at the time.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. See, this is why I love deep dives. You catch these little details that just completely change the game. And speaking of details, there's something else that totally blew my mind, those footnotes about the word create itself. It's not just used once and done. It actually changes slightly when it's talking about plants, animals, and then finally humans. Like the writer's making a very deliberate point.
You're picking up on something huge here. The Hebrew language is really specific when it comes to verbs for create. Each one has these subtle shades of meaning, and the writer chose them very carefully.
Okay, so break it down for me. What's the difference?
So for plants, the verb used suggests this effortless creation, like God just spoke them into being, boom, done. With animals, it's more about bringing forth life from the waters. Still within the natural order, but a bit more hands-on, you could say. But when it comes to humans, that's when things get really interesting.
You've got me hooked. What's the verb for humans?
The writer uses bara. This verb implies something unique, a direct creation. It's the same verb used to describe the creation of the universe itself.
Whoa, okay, that's a big deal. So it's like humans have this special place in the hierarchy of creation. We're not just another species hanging out. We're made in God's image.
Exactly. And establishing that hierarchy right from the get-go, it sets the stage for how humans understand their relationship with God, with each other, with the entire world. It's a foundational idea that sparked centuries of debate.
And speaking of hierarchies in creation, it makes me think about one of the most iconic stories in Genesis, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. But before we get to the forbidden fruit, there's something else I can ask about, something that's been bugging me for, like, ever.
Let me guess, the talking serpent.
Bingo. But here's the thing. Those footnotes got me thinking. What if it wasn't some, demonic being whispering temptations in their ears? The footnotes mention that ancient Jewish tradition actually allowed for the possibility of all animals talking back then. Can you imagine?
Oh, absolutely. It totally changes the whole vibe, doesn't it? Suddenly the Garden of Eden isn't just some peaceful paradise. It's like a zoo out there. Animals chatting it up, birds gossiping in the trees.
Right, like a Disney movie, but with, like, theological implications. So if talking animals were the norm, what's so cunning about the serpent? Everyone's doing it.
That's where it gets really interesting. Some scholars, even way back when, like that historian Josephus, thought maybe the serpent was just, well, jealous. We humans were the new kids on the block, created in God's image, and maybe he couldn't handle it.
So like a cosmic case of sibling rivalry.
Exactly. But when you've got a whole world of talking animals, the serpent's cunning takes on a whole new meaning. Like maybe he used a specific kind of animal language humans couldn't understand, or maybe he knew how to play on pre-existing animal hierarchies to get his message across. We don't know exactly how he did it, which makes it even more intriguing.
It's like the writer saying, I'm not going to spell it out for you, use your imagination. And I love that. Okay, so moving on from talking animals, let's talk about those infamous curses after the whole fruit incident. I was reading the footnotes about Eve's desire for her husband and how most people interpret it romantically. But the footnotes suggest something else is going on. Can you shed some light on that?
Oh, definitely. And this is where understanding the nuances of ancient Hebrew comes in handy. The word often translated as desire, in that passage, teshuka, it can also mean to control or to dominate. And when you consider that Eve's curse also includes the line, he will dominate you, well, it kind of paints a different picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, less about romance, more about a power struggle.
Exactly. This power dynamic, especially between men and women, it's a recurring theme throughout Genesis. Think about Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel. These women are constantly navigating a world where their agency is limited, yet they find these clever, often very subtle ways to assert their influence.
It's like the writer's subtly challenging the norms of the time, even if it's not a full-blown feminist manifesto.
That's a great way to put it, and it's one of the things that makes Genesis so endlessly fascinating. It operates on multiple levels, reflecting the complexities of its time, while also hinting at these deeper, more universal truths.
Okay, let's move on to another story that sparked endless debate, Cain and Abel. You've got these two brothers, one's a farmer, the other's a shepherd. Both offer sacrifices to God. Cain follows the rules, plays it by the book, but Abel goes above and beyond. And for some reason, that matters. But the text never actually says why. What's up with that?
Ah, yes. The age-old question, why did God favor Abel's sacrifice? It's one for the ages. Some scholars believe it comes down to the quality of the offering. Abel brought the firstborn and the fattest from his flock, implying a deeper level of devotion, right? Others look to the New Testament, specifically the letter to the Hebrews. It's a letter, by the way, written to early Christians, and it often reflects back on the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus.
Right, so it's like a commentary on the earlier text, offering a different perspective.
Precisely. And in Hebrews, it suggests that Abel acted in faith, while Cain, well, not so much. But you're right, Genesis itself is silent on God's reasoning. It leaves it open to interpretation, which honestly makes it so much more interesting.
Totally. It's like the writer saying, I'm not going to spoon feed you the answer, you wrestle with this. Okay, so we've talked about talking animals, brotherly rivalry, divine preference. But before we move on, there's one more thing I got to bring up, the flood. God is so fed up with humanity's shenanigans, he decides to hit the reset button. Well, almost. Noah and his family, plus a boatload of animals, literally get a second chance. But here's the kicker. Those footnotes point out that the word translated as sorry when God's reflecting on creation.
Yeah.
It can have other meanings, too. It's not necessarily a straightforward regret.
You've hit on a really important point. It's just one word, but it carries so much weight. It shapes how we understand God, you know? Is he truly remorseful? Did he have a change of heart? Or is it something else? Disappointment, grief, maybe even righteous anger.
So it's not a simple case of buyer's remorse.
Not necessarily. The ambiguity of that word, it forces us to confront some big questions. Does God make mistakes? Can he change his mind? If he knew humans would screw up, why even bother creating us in the first place? These are questions that people have been wrestling with for centuries, and there are no easy answers.
It's like the text itself is inviting us into the conversation, saying, here's the dilemma, what do you think? Which, let's be honest, is way more interesting than just being told what to believe. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground, from the power of names and those chatty animals to divine decisions and even a little bit of, shall we say, creative interpretation of the rules.
It's remarkable how much depth we can uncover when we take the time to really dig into these ancient stories.
Totally. And, I have to say, I'm seeing the book of Genesis in a whole new light now. It's not just a collection of moral lessons or a history textbook. It's like a tapestry woven from all these different threads, language, culture, theology, even a touch of humor, right?
Absolutely. And those seemingly insignificant footnotes, they're like those little threads, you know? They give us these glimpses into the bigger picture, help us appreciate the artistry of the whole thing.
It's like watching those behind-the-scenes features on a DVD. Suddenly you realize how much effort went into every single scene, every detail.
Precisely. And just like a good movie, Genesis reveals new layers of meaning the more you revisit it. But, we haven't even touched on the patriarchs yet. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and those guys. Talk about a family drama.
Oh man, don't even get me started on those guys. But you're right, they're essential to the whole Genesis saga. And speaking of the patriarchs, there's one recurring theme that always makes me chuckle, the whole "my wife is my sister" routine. I mean, come on, Abraham pulls that stunt twice. You'd think he'd come up with a new trick after the first time.
It's definitely a pattern that makes you raise an eyebrow, right? And while fear might be part of it, I mean, think about it. Back then, hospitality was everything. If you stumbled upon some powerful ruler, he could literally decide he wanted your wife. End of story. But the footnotes, they suggest something more strategic might be at play too.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Strategic how?
Well, think about the social dynamics back then. A woman under her brother's protection, she was basically off limits. But a woman traveling alone without a male guardian, she could be seen as fair game. So by saying Sarah's his sister, Abraham might be trying to, avoid any unwanted attention while also giving himself a bit of an advantage.
So less about being a cowardly husband, more about playing the game to survive and prosper.
Exactly. And it reminds us that these biblical figures, even the ones we consider heroes of the faith, they were complex people just like us. They made mistakes, they acted out of self-interest, and sometimes they even resorted to a little trickery to get what they wanted.
Which, let's be honest, makes them a lot more relatable than some perfect, untouchable icons, really.
Precisely. It's their flaws, their struggles,
Yeah.
those moments of brilliance and those moments of, shall we say, creative problem solving. It all adds up. It creates this rich tapestry that is Genesis. It reminds us that even our most cherished stories, while they're rarely simple or straightforward, they're messy, they're contradictory, and that's what makes them so compelling.
And that's what I love about these deep dives. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about embracing the complexity, the ambiguity. And speaking of ambiguity, there's one more footnote I got to bring up before we wrap things up. It's about Jacob, Isaac's son, the ultimate trickster. He even cons his own brother out of his birthright. But here's the thing, and I love this. The footnote points out that the name Jacob actually means he trips up or he grabs the heel, which basically foreshadows his entire life story.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
And it gets better. His brother, Esau, he actually calls him out on it after being tricked. It's like the text itself is winking at us, saying, "See what I did there?"
It's true. It's a perfect example of the literary genius woven throughout Genesis. The author, they're not just telling stories, they're playing with language, using wordplay and foreshadowing to create these multi-layered narratives. They reward a careful reader. It's like those hidden Easter eggs you find in movies. Once you see them, it adds a whole other level.
And that's what makes this whole deep dive so rewarding. We're not just skimming the surface, we're digging deep, uncovering those hidden gems, those moments of irony, of surprise, of humor even. And it makes these ancient texts come alive. It reminds us that the people who wrote them, the people who lived them, they weren't so different from us. They wrestled with the same big questions, they grappled with the same human flaws, and they found meaning in those messy, complicated stories. And that's something we can all relate to, right?
Absolutely. It's a timeless human experience finding ourselves in these ancient narratives. And I think that's something worth remembering as we continue to engage with these texts, to let them challenge us, inspire us, and yes, even make us laugh from time to time.
Well said. It's been a pleasure diving deep with you today. And to everyone listening, we hope you've enjoyed this journey through the fascinating world of Genesis. Remember, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep those footnotes handy, and most importantly, keep those conversations going.
Absolutely. Happy reading, everyone.
Let me know what you guys think below in the comments section. We love replying to your comments. And if you're not already subscribed, you're going to miss out on some great content. So take a moment to subscribe now. Thanks again for watching our video and sharing the gospel. Don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with friends. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.